welcome. And today, again, we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, call this Dead Sea Scrolls Part 2. So, I wanted to talk a little bit today about the texts themselves and what group we think created these texts, or at least preserved them. So, like I said, we have Bible, everything from everything except Esther. We have And then we have all sorts of other documents. Some we find in other locations, and we have tried to determine what are these other writings, which of them are specific to the group at Qumran, and others are just part of the larger Jewish literature at this time. So we divide them into these three categories. And I did want to make reference to the handout where it shows you in a very, very dramatic way how some of these older copies of the Hebrew texts that we found at the Dead Sea have changed, changed our interpretation. And so, there are many places that that it has helped clarify. We've had something to compare it to. But what we want to focus on for us is the sectarian documents. And one of the things as we see them is that whereas there are no apocalypses found at the Dead Sea, at least sectarian apocalypses, that this really was an apocalyptic community, and they were expecting they were living in the moment, that God would soon intervene. Before we get to that, then, I wanted to say that Josephus, we'll jump to Josephus, talks about the first century CE and talks about two groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and then a group known as the Essenes. The Essenes were not a group that we knew much about, except for Josephus and a few other sources, but it has pretty much, just like Qumran has been attached to the library, so the place of Qumran has been attached to those books, it is generally now understood that the Essenes, these are at least somehow related to the community that we discovered at Qumran. So there are several ancient references that say that the Essenes live near the Dead Sea. So there is that. There is also a lot of description, a lot of similarities in the description of Josephus and others to how the Essenes lived, and the laws that we found and the documents we found at Qumran. There's an overlap. And so what we've come to believe is that the Essenes, who lived in the cities, various places around, but within the cities, they kept, they sort of had an organized life within the city, where they would meet on a regular basis, and they would share share their money. There was an orientation process, sometimes up to 3 years, by which one would become a novice and eventually become a full-fledged member of the community. And so when we think, to be a little bit more direct about it, what do we see between what we know of the Essenes and the sectarian documents at the Dead Sea? One, is determinism. So just to go through some of the ways that they thought, they believed in this idea that the future was planned out, that they and determined, and they, of course, is the way apocalyptic groups work. They were the ones in the right, or the righteous ones. So that's, thing about apocalyptic is this idea of determinism, and always with the group, self-identified group as the God's favorite. Life after death, which was not, hopefully you've realized, was not a universally held belief, but it is something the Essenes and the Pharisees, actually, and the Christianity and the Dead Sea seems share. There's a definite sense of this organized life, which I mentioned, where there was an admissions process that took about 3 years. They had regular meetings, and they ate together. So the meetings in general, and then sort of community eating, and the shared property, and a system of elders that sort of regulated the community. And so it seemed like a highly organized life. One of the things that actually sort of clinches the deal in an odd sort of way is that among the Essenes, there was a very specific rule that the Essenes followed, and we find that same rule. The only other place we find it is at the Dead Sea, and it has to do with spitting on the floor during an assembly. So it says in both the Essene documents that we have, or the descriptions of the Essenes we have, and the Dead Sea community, that one is not allowed to spit on the floor during an assembly. Kind of wonder why they'd make rules like that, but whatever that meant. But this is, again, the way that it's phrased. The whole concept of it is that these are the Essenes. So what we then have come to believe is that the Essenes were the larger community for which Qumran was the retreat or the religious center. Whether it was a celibate male community, but there is a sense that whoever these people were who lived in the cities, Qumran is somehow attached to them as a religious, in terms of the religious community. But the only, sort of a problem, the one thing that's still difficult for us to figure out is marriage and celibacy in terms of the Essenes and the Qumran community. It's unclear whether Essenes were allowed to marry. There's a sense that was not necessarily encouraged, but they also had families. They're described as having adopted children to raise in the community, and then perhaps, so was it a celibate community? Was it an all-male community? There's some piece like the cemetery and pulls us in one direction, the sort of suspicion of marriage. But in the end, the one thing that becomes clear is that many of the descriptions of the end times, in the great battle, and when God comes and God's kingdom is restored, there will be families. So they didn't necessarily see celibacy and male and single-sex communities as the end goal, but a temporary. So the family is very important, at least at a theoretical level. So what little we know of them, this group, we find in the Damascus document. This is found both at the Dead Sea and in Egypt at the Cairo Geniza. So this is one document that shows us that whatever, the Essenes, that the Qumran and the Essene community was larger than just that one site. It's very cryptic. It seems to be a real intention not to name names and be very specific. But the history says that there was a group of individuals, as this is how the Damascus document describes it, who were dissatisfied with what was going on in the temple. And so again, this would be that time during Antiochus and the selling of the high priesthood to the highest bidder and everything. But the group itself didn't really lacked a leader. And so that talks about then a man referred to as the teacher of righteousness. And this is a really important figure in the Dead Sea, this man, the teacher of righteousness, who came and who led them into the desert, and they became the temple in exile. So you have a dissatisfied group of believers, Jewish believers, who coalesce around this otherwise unnamed figure, the teacher of righteousness, who it says leads them into the desert, and there they form, as I said, the temple in exile. So again, this idea there's something wrong with what's going on in Jerusalem, and this is the protest community. But more specifically, and I mentioned calendars before, the idea is one of the major disagreements is over calendars. So the idea then, that we find in apocalyptic, that worship in heaven is paralleled by worship on earth, and in order to line it up, the ritual done on earth had to be done at the same time as in heaven, and for that to line up, the calendar, you had to be using the right calendar. And so this is, again, the idea that the calendar, which was a solar calendar that they were using, was the correct calendar, and so they continued to worship as they saw, whereas the temple in Jerusalem was using their own calendar. There's even, at one point we know that the high priest's army attacked Qumran specifically on a day that, according to the solar calendar, was a ritual holiday or high holy day, and was not on the Jerusalem temple's calendar. And they used that as a way of attacking Qumran community because they knew they would not fight back, because you were not allowed to fight on these highly important ritual days. So anyway, we have the teacher of righteousness, and we'll just, who then, sorry about that, who brings the community together. He does, however, die. We hear his death is recorded in the Qumran material. But their belief, the teacher of righteousness himself was not connected with their hope for the coming kingdom of God. It seems the group survived maybe 40 years or more, and even survived the predictions of the coming of the end of time. So it's survived many sort of, sort of blows to their interpretation of how the world was going to come to an end. And so probably survived, like I said already, until, not 70 years, but till sometime around 70 CE, and it was the Romans that finally did them in, and not any religious issues. So again, I cannot overemphasize how important it is to understand this figure. It's true for this group and for apocalyptic groups in general. There's a figure always. Whatever he comes to represent in the group is the one that brings them unites them and gives them purpose and energy to the point where then they are willing to form a group and in some ways retreat or separate themselves from society. So then I wanted to sort of expand on the sort of cast of characters. There's definite figures that are represented. It's all in very non-specific, almost coded language. But I've already mentioned the most important, this figure named the Teacher of Righteousness, and being the not perhaps the beginning of the group, but the man who took this discontented group of individuals, priests perhaps, and took them into the desert. He is indeed a very specific person. We don't have any clue who he is, name-wise, except that he was likely of the Zadokite line, which made him, that's the line of the high priest. And we got back to what I was, when we were discussing the line of the high priest in the Hasmonean period, there was that 7-year silence where we don't know who was the high priest, and there is a lot of speculation, you can't prove it now, that during that 7 years it was this Teacher of Righteousness who was in the temple, it was the high priest of the temple, and it was, somehow he was ousted, and that's when he took his group into the desert. So there does seem to be a significant claim that whoever this man was, that he had the right to run the temple. So, but again, a name, a historical figure, lost to us. So we do think, though, and if you read deeply, the parts of what is known as the Thanksgiving Scroll is in the first person, and it does seem to perhaps be some form of autobiographical references of the high priest, the Teacher of Righteousness. Now, one thing I want to say, again, to emphasize, is that the group survived the death of the Teacher of Righteousness, and in part that's because he was never considered messianic or the one, so the idea of the coming of the end, the idea of a Messiah who would come, then there's often a belief in someone who would precede the Messiah, and you can see this in the New Testament in the speculation about Elijah, about, and John the Baptist. Elijah was understood as coming to precede the coming of the Messiah, but the Teacher of Righteousness was not really ever understood as the Messiah, but it was more because of his particular interpretation of Judaism and of the law, that he was his truth, as they understood it, the truth of his interpretation meant that the end was near. But this is partly why the group survived his death, because they did not see him necessarily as the Messiah, but as the one who was going to give the true and righteous and faithful, the correct interpretation of the law, of the Bible, because the end indeed was close. So, the Teacher of Righteousness. There are a couple more figures that get a lot of that are mentioned. After the Teacher of Righteousness is someone known as the wicked priest. So he's the bad guy in all of this. Now I wanted to just we don't know who this figure is either, but there does seem to be a word play or a sound play going on. So the high priest, HaKohen, Ha-Rosh, that's the Kohen, priest, Rosh, head. So this is the Hebrew for high priest. Now the word wicked priest, or the phrase wicked priest, is HaKohen HaRasha. So, this wicked priest, since there's a lot of speculation that this is sort of a coded name for the high priest operating in the temple during the time of the life of the teacher of righteousness. And so it's, all here we can speculate, was it Jonathan or Simon? But one of the Hasmonean rulers, probably, who also took on or claimed to be the high priest as well. So when you get that high priest and the ruler with Jonathan and then Simon together, that's, of course it is based on this, but it's awfully suspicious, isn't it, that when we talk about the wicked priest, we should hear some reference to the high priest, whoever it was, in Jerusalem. So again, we work with what we have. Then a third figure, the man of mockery, or lies. He is also a bad guy. But whoever this figure is, he wasn't an official religious leader. It seems that the teacher of righteousness and the man of mockery had once been friends or allies in some way, and that there had been a split between the teacher of righteousness and this man. It has to do with the interpretation of the law, which is all of this is about the proper interpretation of the law. And they split, and then he becomes sort of the rival. We do perhaps hear, if the wicked priest is the high priest of the Hasmonean line, again, we don't have a name, but there seems to be so much similarity between the Pharisees and the Qumran community, and there's lots of reasons to believe that that this man of mockery might have been the founder of the of the Pharisees, so that you've got the teacher of righteousness and the Pharisees both being in alignment about certain things, but at some point they split, and the teacher of righteousness retreats. And of course, as you know, the Pharisaic movement became very popular, did not retreat, but worked among the community, and they were indeed very popular, the Pharisees. So the man of mockery, but in some ways, even worse, because he's the guy that at least initially agreed with the teacher of righteousness. So you have the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, the man of mockeries, and then just to mention one more or two more figures that, when I took a class in Qumran before the scrolls were fully translated or even fully seen, the idea of, if the teacher of righteousness isn't the Messiah, then who is? And what we find is really fascinating, that the Qumran community saw not one, but two messiahs. So this was not completely clear to us, but basically there was a messiah, a priestly messiah, and a royal messiah. And so the priestly line, so a descendant of the Levitical or Zadokite line, probably, and then David, the Davidic line. And of course, this is the kind of Messiah that we're, oops, didn't mean to do that. Just take that off, because that's what we expect, I think, when we think of Messiah. And so what the Qumran community adds is this idea of a priestly Messiah. And if you look and read through the documents of what the world looks like in the Messianic age, the priestly is the more important. He precedes, he is given more importance in all of the material at Qumran. So the priority of the priestly Messiah seems to be central to, well, the fact that there are two Messiahs at all, but that the priestly Messiah would be the one who gains supremacy. So, there's lots of things to be said about that, but you can definitely see that, this is the kind of thinking that would come out of a predominantly priestly group, and the importance of the ritual over the rule. And we see this in other places where you've got a son of in other. This isn't the only place we see this, but it doesn't really kind of sputters out, and it doesn't really gain much in the long term. So just then to go back and say a couple more things before I stop. The idea is, again, that the Qumran community is, and the ones who have the library and who produced the sectarian scrolls was an apocalyptic community. So everything you know about apocalyptic and their worldview applies to Qumran and what we know about that. But we add in the calendar issue, and that this particular group that formed Qumran is an apocalyptic community with a very strong priestly bent. So the idea of the calendar, but also the ritual bathing, just is extreme, really, compared to other Jewish communities of the time. They saw that, again, the need for an orderly universe, but there's a very strong sense that the world is made up of two spirits, and that good and evil who hold sway for human beings, and evil comes from, and our bad choices come from, the influence of the evil spirit. So the good spirit versus the evil spirit, and again, God is in control of history, so God, the evil spirit, ultimately it has no power except what God allows it, and eventually the world will come to, when it comes to an end, the evil spirit will be wiped out. And so really, to sort of finish up, the Qumran community, again, very priestly, very religious, very much focused on the law, and particularly the law of Moses. And here's another, maybe I should sort of, if you think about the law of Moses, in written form, that's the Torah. And so you have groups like the Sadducees, the more conservative groups who said the law of Moses was the Torah. But then you had groups like the Pharisees, who believed in the written law and the oral law. And this idea of oral law was that Moses wrote down some of what was revealed to him, but some of it was passed down orally through, through the priestly line. And so what you get with the teacher of righteousness, here's another way to think about it, the idea of the teacher of righteousness was like the Pharisees in the sense that they accepted the written law, but that they also had what they called the oral law. And for people at Qumran, the oral law, or another way to put it, is the teacher of righteousness was considered having been endowed with the ability to interpret the law, and that his interpretation of the law was the correct one. And so he is both, in this person, then the community felt that they had not only access to the Torah, but the correct interpretation of the Torah. So there is some parallels with the idea of the oral law. And so he becomes, again, not a messianic figure, but the interpreter of events for the people at Qumran.